I think also written is that there's been three parts to the Ukrainian drama, so to speak. And the first part was expansion of NATO in Ukraine in order to get Ukraine into NATO. That has lasted over 30 years. It's not a new thing, but media don't know any history. NATO's expansion 30 years ago, where we promised Gorbachev not to expand NATO. We broke our promises. Also, and Mr. Putin said in his speech at the security conference in Munich in 2007 to the West, what happened to all your promises? You broke them. The answer he got to that was in 2008, that NATO decided that Ukraine should become a member of NATO. Everybody who knew anything about security politics and were independent-minded have warned against it, including myself. This will lead to war. The second part of the drama was to militarize Ukraine, pump in weapons, and use Ukraine as a non-member of NATO to fight and weaken Russia. That was the statement from the Secretary of Defense in the United States. We're out to weaken Russia. And we do that by pumping in weapons and training Ukrainians' military system so that they can win on our behalf. What he didn't say was that's a nice idea because then we don't have to waste the lives of any NATO soldiers. It's incredible to me to see that European and American leaders are now living so much in their own secluded world that they think that by pumping in even more weapons and ammunition to a country that has paid a tremendous human price, namely Ukraine, for this, that then we can win over Russia. We can use Ukraine to win over our opponent without losing any of our own lives. I mean, this is one of the most cynical theories practiced that I have experienced during my lifetime. And I stand totally with the innocent people of Ukraine. They are the victims of the whole game between NATO and Russia. The West actively prevented a solution almost 2 years ago. Boris Johnson was one of those who were sent to Kiev to say, don't negotiate. Stop the negotiations about a peaceful solution or something like that. So there we are. The EU today is still talking about arming further Ukraine and having more bloodshed, instead of saying it's time for all of us to save lives and talk with the Russians. But, you know, we've secluded the Russians. We've almost cut off all relationships with Russia. And no matter what you think about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that was a wrong policy. The sanctions were a wrong policy because it was not an unprovoked. I'm not legitimating what was done, but it was not unprovoked. It was very provoked. So when NATO said it was an unprovoked attack by Russia on Ukraine, we know it was exactly that. It was not unprovoked. But that's a kind of, rhetoric that is used. And then came another nail in the Western dominance coffin, and that has been Nord Stream. Nord Stream was destroyed as the largest infrastructure destruction in modern times. And third, then comes now abandonment. We couldn't care less about this because now we have more important things to do, namely the Middle East and Gaza. And so I believe that the United States has, for all practical purposes, dropped Ukraine. And the price for the war and the continued military support to it is now what the European Union is discussing and is insisting on. The EU has today a summit where a huge package for Ukraine is going to be either going through in the European Union's summit. The West is now Titanic on its way down. And I'm very sad to see, going back to the summit of the European Union has not been able to represent, to develop itself as a union, as a second West, somebody who are different from the United States. It takes orders from the United States. And now the European Union and Europe will have to pay the price for NATO's expansion and for the rebuilding of Ukraine, because the Americans are saying, hey, we're leaving. like they did in Afghanistan, like they did in Iraq, basically, like they've done everywhere else. When they find out that this didn't work the way we thought it will, you pull out and you start something else. For them, for Washington, what happens in the Middle East is much more important. Ukraine was never a strategically important country. Now, what everybody who is objectively and looking at it in a neutral way from the outside can see is Ukraine is not going to win militarily. It doesn't mean, in my view, necessarily that Russia will win, because Russia will have lots of problems after the war has ended. We're soon hitting 2 years of the Ukraine war. They are not changing paths towards negotiations, opening up dialogue, talking about alternative. They are still into the military toolbox. And that will have a tremendous price for Europe itself. We will have even deeper economic problems than we have now. We will have skyrocketing prices. We will have energy that will be very expensive. We will have social protests. We will see, people will begin to see that they are paying for a military system that has not created peace. The Swedish people is now into, going into NATO, probably, very likely. And before that even happens, the Americans have boxed through bilateral agreement with Sweden about 17 American base facilities and harbors and God knows what in Sweden. Now, what do you think that is going to cost the Swedish people, who need better schools, who need better healthcare? These people seem to think that they have unlimited economies. They don't seem to understand that the militarism will undermine civil society and civil economy. And then we will sit down and say, oh, these terrible Chinese, they are surpassing us and they are having faster development. Yeah, because you don't waste your money on warfare around the world. It's very simple. The biggest reason that the Western empire is falling is militarism and self-destructive policies. That's what I've been saying for decades. Militarism is much more important than most people think. But that's because militarism is never addressed in our media. People don't understand the price of armament, of the arms economy, of pumping in weapons and destruction and rebuilding societies afterwards. The most stupid thing humanity can do. And the Western world is number one, second to none in this stupid activity. It's very sad. The whole drama is a Shakespearean drama of suicide, if you will.